You didn't have a seatbelt on. You were in the back seat, maybe the front seat actually. Your parents were smoking with the windows cracked, Fleetwood Mac or the Eagles bleeding through the AM radio, and nobody was worried about you. It wasn't neglect, they just weren't watching. And something about that shaped you in ways you're probably still unpacking. People who spent their formative years in the 1970s bear a fingerprint that runs through the generation that's not so obvious. It goes deeper than just nostalgia, as that's thrown around so often, or even the phrase, things were simpler back then. I mean, yes, it may be true, however, we're going to discover what that actually looks like. Let's start with something that's a bit hard to talk about, shall we? The 1970s was the first decade where the American family began visibly fracturing in real time. Divorce rates skyrocketed, doubling between the 60s and 80s, and eventually peaking in the mid to late 70s. This was more than a statistic for millions of kids. For them, it was a Thursday, their reality. Researchers who studied what's sometimes called the divorce generation have found that children who went through family breakups during this period developed a very specific worldview. Love is conditional, stability is temporary, and adults are doing the best they can even when the best isn't good enough. That last part matters because kids raised in the 70s didn't just learn that things fall apart, they became accustomed to it, to keep going when the going gets hard, to not make it weird at school on Monday. And there's something almost tragic about how functional that made you. Picture this. It's 1977. You're 11 years old. Your mom is late picking you up from a friend's house. She forgot. She's working two jobs now that your dad walked out 8 months ago. She doesn't say sorry since you don't expect her to. You both get in the car and look straight ahead, and the silence isn't angry, it's just the shape of things now. You've become an expert at reading the room since you were a small child. Psychologists that looked into emotional development in children of divorce, including E. Mavis Hetherington, whose 20-year study of more than 450 families is still one of the most encompassing of its kind, discovered a pattern they termed parentification. It's basically when kids start taking on emotional responsibilities that usually belongs to adults, since the ones around them were overwhelmed or just spread way too thin. From the outside, it looks like that kid is really mature for their age, but inside, they tend to feel rather lonely. You became capable very quickly, maybe too quickly. You learned to ask for less and learned things like your needs made other people tired. This is maybe the part where a lot of people watching this start to feel something uncomfortable. Because if that's you, you've probably spent the majority of your adult life believing that your self-sufficiency is just your personality. However, it could just as easily be a coping strategy that's transformed into its own character trait, and that is a significant difference. But here's the thing about 70s kids that gets completely overlooked when people talk about your generation. You were also extraordinarily free. Not free in a romanticized way, not the kind of freedom that gets turned into a movie montage. Real, unsupervised, figure-it-out-yourself freedom. You left the house after breakfast and came back when the streetlights came on, and nobody tracked you. Nobody could. There were no cell phones, there was no location sharing. Your parents had a rough idea of the direction you went, and that was considered enough. Developmental psychologists have explored a lot about unstructured, kid-led play, and Peter Gray has written extensively on this important topic. Although play doesn't seem like a serious activity, it teaches kids crucial life lessons. Those children who spent their childhood in the 1970s got a lot of this. You worked out your own fights on your street, made up your own game rules, sorted it out for yourself who you could trust and who you couldn't, with no adults stepping in to control any of it. As supported by research, a generation that is unusually adept at managing ambiguity is produced by this. You can remain uncertain about possible future outcomes in a way that honestly trips people up a lot, most notably the younger generations. It's like a mantra. You don't need a resolution right now. You've kind of been looking for that your whole life, but you've become an expert at waiting. There was also something else happening in the culture that was seeping into you whether you realized it or not. The 1970s was saturated with a collective disillusionment that had no clean name. Vietnam had ended badly. Nixon resigned. Inflation was brutal. The optimism of the 60s had curdled into something more suspicious, more sardonic, and children absorbed the emotional temperature of their era the same way they absorb language, not by being taught it, but by swimming in it. What this gave a lot of 70s kids was a very early, very functional sense of irony, a suspicion of authority that wasn't cynicism exactly. It was more like a calibrated skepticism. You didn't assume institutions were good. You didn't assume adults in charge knew what they were doing, because the evidence, even filtered through a child's understanding, suggested otherwise. The data behind that intuition is striking. In 1964, 77% of Americans said they trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. By 1980, the year many of you were finishing childhood, that number had collapsed to 25%, a 52-point drop in roughly one generation. You didn't learn distrust from a textbook, you absorbed it from the air your parents breathed, the news playing in the other room, and the weight in adult conversations you weren't supposed to be listening to, but absolutely were. That's not nothing. That actually matters. And yet, and this is what I find genuinely moving when I think about it, despite all of that, despite the fractured homes and the benign neglect and the cultural pessimism you marinated in, people who grew up in the 70s have some of the most fiercely loyal, quietly deep relationships of any generation. Because when you love someone, you mean it. You didn't grow up in a world that performed connection constantly. You didn't have an infinite feed of social affirmation. When someone showed up for you, you felt it, and you never forgot it. The relationships you've held on to, the friendships from your 20s, the people you've kept in your life through everything, those aren't casual. There's a gravity to your attachments that comes directly from having learned that not everything stays. So when something does, you hold it carefully. Psychologist Dan McAdams has done a lot of work on something he calls narrative identity, which is the idea that we make sense of ourselves through the stories we tell about our lives. For those who grew up in conditions of instability or emotional complexity, this narrative work often tends to be richer, more layered, and more honestly held. You're not shocked to see contradiction in people. Since childhood, you've been living in a contradiction. This represents a certain kind of wisdom rather than a wound. The kids of the 70s who learned to cycle home alone, who sat in the back of a smoky car, who grew up in a world that was openly falling apart, and who still managed to find something precious and worthwhile to hold on to. That person developed something that no curriculum teaches and that no structured childhood reliably produces: a tolerance for reality exactly as it is. And if you recognize yourself in any of this, if anything in this was less a video and more someone finally saying aloud what you have quietly thought for decades, then you probably already know what I mean. While I have you here, it would mean a lot if you subscribed. There's also a join button on the channel if you ever want to directly support more of these deep dives. Check out some of my other Psychology Simplified videos on the screen that I think you'll enjoy. Meet you there.